May it please the court. "10 seconds before crash. This company's pilot told air traffic control 4 important words. I should never happen. And while he didn't finish his sentence, the evidence that we showed you today did that for him. The evidence said he never should have flown too low, never should have flown in mountainous terrain, never should have flown in hazardous weather conditions. And when this company's pilot broke those rules, his passenger paid with her life. Members of the jury, since the beginning of this trial, hundreds, maybe thousands of passengers have been flown safely to their destination. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because pilots followed the rules. They've got to file a flight plan with the FAA to make sure every part is safe. And then they've got to stick to that flight plan. And when this company's pilot was on the runway waiting to take off at 7:45, he knew the rules because he had an FAA-approved flight plan to fly at 1,500 feet and to stay west of the mountains. Now, if he were just going for a joyride, just flying solo, the consequences of his poor decisions would fall on his shoulders alone. But he wasn't alone. Members of the jury, he had this man's wife with him. And according to the law, that meant that he owed her a duty of care. But he was more interested in sightseeing than he was in following rules. You can see he gets away with it the first time he flies around the Basin Island. But he gets bolder. He wants to show her the mountains, and he wants to show her the mountains up close. Even though he knows never to approach a mountain from the downwind side at 8:40, he decides to go for it anyway. He deviates 2.5 miles east, 1,000 feet below the altitude he told the FAA he'd fly at. And at 8:43, the downwinds are too strong. He can't increase his altitude, and he crashes. When this company's pilot broke the rules, our community lost a civil servant. 2 children lost their mother. A husband lost his wife. That's why R.A. Felder is bringing a claim of negligence against the company that killed his wife, Koller-Campbell LLC. Before we even step foot in trial today, the defense, they admitted 2 things. That they owed Morgan Felder a duty of care, and that Morgan Felder suffered harm. So all we needed to prove was that the duty of care was breached, and that breach was the direct and proximate cause of Morgan Felder's harm. And in the minutes remaining, I'll show you how we've met that burden, by showing you 3 decisions the pilot never should have made that were the direct cause of Morgan Felder's harm. Poor decision number 1, flying too low. Members of the jury, as you go back to deliberate, you'll see the flight plan. The cruising altitude in the top right corner, 1,500 feet. And yet, we heard today that before he crashed, Reese Campbell was at 308 feet above the ground. But for that dangerous decision, Morgan Felder would still be alive. R.A. Felder told us that the tallest peak in the Mount McIntosh range is 1,000 feet. So if the pilot had stayed at the altitude he planned, he proposed, he promised, they'd still be safe. Poor decision number 2, deviating into mountainous terrain. See, on this flight plan, it's the gray dashed line, it stays west of the mountains. But you can see in the actual flight plan, he deviates into the mountains. Now, on the map, it doesn't look very long. It looks like maybe an inch or so. But what you heard today is that this little inch or so, that represents 2.5 miles, members of the jury. He deviated 2.5 miles east into the mountain range, but for that decision, Morgan Felder, she'd still be alive. Decision number 3, ignoring the signs of mountain air turbulence. Folks, we heard today that flying in mountainous terrain is not like flying on flat ground. But let's be clear what's the danger here, because the danger isn't flying near a mountain, flying hundreds of feet, thousands of feet away from a mountain. The danger is flying on the downwind side of the mountain. That's what Aubrey Roy told us, that's what Dr. Savchenko told us. Well, what was the downwind side? According to the weather reports, as Dr. Savchenko explained, the wind was coming from the northeast direction. The downwind side is the exact side that the pilot approached on. the southwest side. We also have physical evidence to prove this, because members of the jury, Dr. Savchenko said that flight data recording showed that the pilot had pulled back on the control yoke and to the left, indicating that the pilot was trying to climb his altitude, but no altitude detection was noticed. In fact, as you read Exhibit 3, the Mayday call, you'll see that the pilot says, "I'm following." He's following, members of the jury, because even though he's pulling back, the downwinds are pushing his plane into the mountain. And but for the decision to ignore the signs of that downdraft, of going on the downwind side of the mountain, Morgan Felder should still be alive. But what about proximate cause? How could Reese-Campbell know that what he was going to do would result in Morgan Felder's harm? Well, you got the treatment today because when Aubrey Roy showed you these images, those were the same images she showed Reese-Campbell. She told you never to approach a mountain on the downwind side. She said, be careful of flying into mountain ranges. And she said that when she flew this gray line with him 2 days earlier, that was safe. And he knew it was safe. Members of the jury, he knew that deviating into the mountain would cause a crash. And he did it anyway. In a moment, Mr. Vapa is going to stand right here. And he's going to try to distract you from the fact that their pilot broke rules 3 times. He's going to try to claim that Morgan Felder assumed the risks of the flight, but let's be clear on what Morgan Felder needed to assume. Because as he's standing here, I want you to consider what she actually knew. Could Morgan Felder have predicted, could she have reasonably known that Reese-Campbell would make not 1, but 2 deviations off of the plane that he promised her? And when Mr. Vapa is finished talking with you, I'll come right back up here and explain how the defense, they failed to meet their burden. I'll remind you that when a pilot broke the rules, his passenger paid with their life. Thank you. Would counsel like me to take down this demonstrative?
Yes, please.